The screen fades from black, an old church bell tolls once, twice, then silence, then a whisper. They tried to burn the records, but the screams wouldn't stop. You weren't supposed to know this story, not because it was lost, but because it was buried, hidden beneath layers of medical lies, erased church archives, and a pact of silence between science and faith. What happened inside Blessed Mercy Infirmary in the winter of 1847 was so horrifying, so destabilizing, that even the doctors who witnessed it fled the state, and the only written proof, found stuffed inside a decaying wall in a locked attic, 143 years later. The girl's name was Latoya. She arrived unconscious in the snow, wearing only a threadbare dress. No family, no past, no logical reason for surviving a Massachusetts winter half-naked in a blizzard. But when she opened her eyes, everything changed. The temperature in the infirmary shifted. Rats disappeared. Bedridden patients walked again. And the dreams? They began the night she was admitted. Dreams that weren't yours. Dreams that knew your guilt. Dreams that spoke in your dead mother's voice. This isn't just another possession tale. It's not about exorcisms or spinning heads or the tired tropes of Hollywood horror. No, this is about control. Psychological, spiritual, historical. What happens when an ancient force, embedded in trauma, reawakens in the very institutions built to suppress it? When a woman branded as unstable begins unlocking memories not just from her own past, but from yours. You're not watching this by accident. You're here because somewhere deep inside you've always felt something was off. In your schools, your churches, your hospitals. Like there's a script running beneath everything you see. And Latoya's case? It didn't just rip the curtain, it torched the stage. If you're ready to descend into the truth, the kind tone, hat rattles your bones and rewrites your idea of evil, stay. But know this, once you hear what really happened in Millbrook, Massachusetts, you don't get to unknow it. You don't get to go back. Whispers echo again. She remembers you. Fade to black. Snow hammered the stained glass windows of Millbrook Infirmary as Sister Agnes took her final round before dusk. The storm had rolled in too fast. Even the bells above the chapel had frozen into silence. The infirmary was quiet until the knock. It wasn't frantic, just rhythmic. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, as if whoever stood beyond the iron doors wasn't seeking shelter but giving a warning. When Sister Agnes opened it, the wind slammed her backward. Standing on the steps barefoot was a young woman, no older than 16. Her skin was blue with cold, her eyes unfocused, her black hair frozen in jagged clumps. But strangest of all, her feet weren't bleeding, not a single scratch from the icy, jagged path that wound through the woods for miles. The snow around her was untouched, as if she'd simply appeared. No one knew who she was, no name, no records. When asked, she muttered just one word, Latoya. That night, strange things began. The crucifix in the infirmary's chapel twisted sideways, the holy water boiled in its bowl, and the staff, many of whom were hardened Civil War nurses and orderlies, began reporting the same thing, voices in their sleep, the same voice, whispering secrets only they could know. Dr. Jeremiah Wexler, chief physician at Millbrook, dismissed it as storm-induced hysteria. Cold and isolation make fools of the faithful, he wrote in his journal, but by morning he'd torn out the page, because by then the scratches had started. One by one, the staff woke with long, identical slashes down their backs, like claw marks, but always in pairs, always symmetrical. Latoya, still in a coma, had to be restrained that morning. Her hands had grown ice-cold and stiff, the tips blackening like frostbitten bark, yet her heartbeat remained perfectly steady, her breathing whisper quiet. But it was the chapel fire that truly shook them. It didn't start in the hearth. It began in the Bible. When they found it, only one page was intact, Mark 5:9. And he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Millbrook's head priest ordered Latoya moved to isolation, but something had already been unleashed. And the worst part? She smiled. Dr. Jeremiah Wexler was not a man of superstition. A Yale-trained physician, he believed firmly in what he could see, measure, and record. But the moment Latoya entered Millbrook Infirmary, something inside him shifted, something that no rational mind could easily explain. And so, in the margins of his medical logbook, he began keeping a second record, a secret one. It began innocently enough, short notations about the girl's condition, her pulse, her temperature, her curious resistance to frostbite. But as the nights passed, the entries grew darker, more erratic. The writing itself changed. What began as crisp script slowly devolved into jagged, frantic scribbles. He was no longer just documenting her body. He was chasing the shape of a nightmare. Day 4, he wrote. Latoya remains silent, but I hear her whispering to someone. I checked her mouth. Lips closed. No sound. But the candlelight flickers in response. Day 6. Her shadow doesn't match her body. He told no one. And yet, behind closed doors, Wexler grew obsessed. He pored over ancient religious texts, many of which he'd confiscated from a local Jesuit who had been declared insane for claiming the forest was cursed. The texts mentioned a spirit, a fragment of something ancient, older than God, that moves through forgotten names and broken souls. It enters through silence, feeds on secrecy, and burrows deep into the memory of the land. One entry chilled even Wexler's hardened soul. She is not possessed. She is inhabited. And it is not one, but many. Something split, bound and buried beneath the church that used to stand here. She is the answer to a ritual that was never meant to finish. He went to visit her again on the 7th night. What he saw drove him to burn 10 years of medical research that very evening. Latoya, bound to the bed with iron cuffs, turned her head without moving a muscle. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was not her own, she said, "You know the name. That is enough." Then she began to bleed from her eyes, not red, but black. The next morning, Wexler submitted his resignation, but he never left, because by dawn he had nailed his hands to the chapel door. The chapel at Millbrook Infirmary was old, far older than the rest of the building. Locals said it was built on the ruins of a Puritan meeting house burned down in 1783 after a blasphemous sermon drove half the congregation mad. For over half a century, the chapel stood silent. No weddings, no funerals, only prayers, and only when needed. It was Sister Marianne who found the stairs. She wasn't looking for them. She'd simply dropped her rosary behind the altar, and while reaching beneath, her fingers brushed something cold. Iron. Not a pipe. A handle. She pulled. A grinding sound echoed through the walls as the altar itself shifted slightly, revealing a hidden stairwell spiraling down into stone. The air that rose from below was thick, heavy with the scent of earth, blood, and something older, something rotten. Against her better judgment, Sister Marianne descended with only a candle to guide her. What she found was a room that shouldn't have existed. It was circular, lined with rusted chains bolted into the walls. In the center stood a stone altar, cracked, scorched, stained black. Symbols were etched into every surface, not Latin, not Greek, but a script that seemed to move when she stared too long. And beside the altar, a chair, wooden, tall-backed, carved with faces that screamed in silence. On the floor around it, 13 small child-sized handprints, burned into the stone. The moment she stepped inside, the candle blew out. But the room didn't go dark. It glowed faintly, from the walls themselves, pulsing like a heartbeat. And though she stood completely alone, Sister Marianne heard chanting. Not loud, not in English, but familiar, like something she'd heard in dreams she could never remember. She ran. When she returned with the other sisters, the stairwell was gone. No altar, no passage, nothing. Only her rosary, lying neatly on the floor. That night, Sister Marianne scrawled a message into her prayer book before setting herself ablaze in the chapel garden. Her last words, barely legible, were, "It's not her, it's them." And they've come back to finish what was started in 1847. The first child was named Eli, 8 years old, a quiet boy with pale skin and a habit of humming to himself when no one was around. 2 weeks after Latoya was admitted, Eli stopped speaking English altogether, not a single word, only strange, guttural phrases that made the other children cry and cover their ears. At first, the staff thought it was a trauma response, but when the other children began repeating the same words, all with different inflections, as if answering one another, it became clear this was no simple breakdown of sanity. It was a conversation, one that had no beginning and no end. Sister Helen, the school's matron, attempted to transcribe the words. She brought in a priest who specialized in dead languages. He never came back. But he left a single page of notes behind, just one phrase, scrawled over and over again. "They are calling something home." The children became obsessed with drawing symbols, circles with lines that bled into one another, spirals made of names no one remembered giving them. One girl, Beatrice, wrote a full page in what looked like Aramaic, despite having never learned to read or write at all. Then came the laughter. It echoed from the walls at night, shrill, layered, mismatched in tone and pitch. Not one child, not two, dozens, hundreds. It would start in the West Wing and ripple through the halls like a wave of hysteria until every child was giggling and shrieking with joy, even those who were sedated. One nurse, Catherine Rowe, tried to leave the grounds after an especially violent fit of laughter left her bleeding from the ears. But when she started her carriage, she found every mirror inside cracked from the inside. The children watched her from the infirmary windows, all of them smiling. In a final act of desperation, the headmaster ordered the children quarantined, doors locked, food slid in on trays. No eye contact, no conversation. But it was too late. One morning, the doors were found wide open. Inside, the children sat in perfect silence, in a circle, around a drawing of Latoya floating, eyes black, mouth open, and behind her, something with too many hands. Dr. Alan Whitmore was a rational man, a devout skeptic. He had served in military hospitals during the Mexican-American War, seen trauma twist the minds of the strongest men. But nothing prepared him for Latoya, or the silence she brought with her. He was the first to examine her after her second incident, when 3 nurses had to be restrained for trying to gouge out their own eyes after witnessing her smile in the hallway mirror. When Dr. Whitmore entered her room, she wasn't restrained. She simply sat, hands folded, eyes focused on the ceiling as if something was crawling across it. He began routine questioning. "Do you know where you are?" She nodded, then whispered, "Still beneath." "Beneath what?" She turned to him, slowly, smiled and said, "Beneath where you buried them. But they never stopped screaming, Doctor." Chilled, he changed the subject. Physical examination. She didn't blink as he checked her pulse. Normal. Pupils, responsive. But her body temperature, 72 degrees. He thought the thermometer was broken. He checked again. Same result. She looked at him, and without moving her lips, whispered into his mind, "They'll take your hands first." The examination ended. Later that night, Dr. Whitmore sat alone in his study, scribbling furiously in his journal. Pages of nonsense, diagrams of a spiral made from human vertebrae, a circle with names he'd never heard, Asheroth, Malimzul, Escatol. Beside it, one phrase circled in red, "She isn't the one cursed, she's the door." The next morning, he was gone. His quarters, locked from the inside, were empty. Only his shoes were found. Still warm, perfectly placed by the foot of his bed, as if he'd stepped out of them and simply vanished into the floor. The journal burned. Every page reduced to ash, except for one scrap wedged beneath the floorboards. It read, Latoya is not her name, it's her warning. When a nurse asked the children what that meant, they all replied in perfect unison, Latoya means she who opens the silence. From that day on, no one, not staff, not patients, would speak her name aloud again. Even the record keepers began calling her only the girl in room 13. Room 13 was never meant to exist. Architectural plans from 1847 clearly showed only 12 patient rooms on the east wing of the Massachusetts asylum, but after Latoya arrived, a 13th room simply appeared. Between room 12 and the linen closet, no construction noises, no fresh paint, just a door, old, blackened, carved with a symbol resembling an eye with no pupil. At first, the staff assumed it was a storage space, but when they opened it, they found Latoya already inside, seated on the bed, as if she had been waiting for them to notice. No one moved her there. No one even saw her enter, and the room was locked from the inside. From the moment she occupied room 13, strange things began to happen to anyone who stood near it. Whispers in languages no one understood. A low, moaning sound, like wind under the floorboards, though there were none. More disturbing still were the sudden nosebleeds that staff experienced within 10 feet of the door, always from the left nostril, always at the stroke of midnight. A janitor named Michael Green tried to paint over the eye symbol carved into the door. He was never seen again. 3 days later, his severed hand was found gripping the doorknob, fingers locked in rigor mortis, as if trying to hold something in rather than out. After that, no one touched room 13. Visitors to the asylum often asked why there was no room 13 on the map. Some joked about superstition, but when they were led down the east wing, they would never find the door, no matter how many times they counted. To them, it simply didn't exist. But the children could see it. They often drew it, black crayon on paper, accompanied by a strange phrase, "The room that hears, the room that knows." Those who dared listen at the door claimed to hear 2 heartbeats, one slow and steady, and another faster, crawling. One nurse, curious and shaken, left a rosary on the handle. The next morning, every bead had melted. Not burned, melted, like wax under something not of this world. When Latoya was asked what the room was, she finally spoke, eyes unblinking. "It's where I listen to the ones who scream forever." After that, room 13 was sealed with iron bolts and a warning etched into the wall. Do not enter, do not speak, do not remember. Yet still, every night someone swore they heard knocking from the inside. It began with a storm, one that wasn't in the forecast. On a humid July evening in 1848, the skies above the asylum turned a dark copper hue. Thunder rumbled, not in bursts, but in long, groaning sighs, as though the heavens were being split open from the inside. The staff called it unnatural, the children called it the moaning sky. And Latoya? She called it feeding time. During that night, the facility's weather vane spun without wind. Dogs from neighboring farms howled until their throats bled. Every clock inside the asylum stopped at exactly 3:06 a.m. The precise moment a red glow filled the eastern hallway. That's when they found the Blood Moon journals. No one knew who wrote them. Leather-bound, stained and hidden beneath a loose tile in the floor outside room 13, the journals appeared to be authored by someone long dead, a man claiming to be the asylum's original builder, Elias Corwin. His writings were feverish and broken, yet detailed. He spoke of a contract made in 1833, well before the asylum was even constructed. A deal between the landowner and something he only referred to as the listener beneath. Corwin claimed that beneath the soil, below the foundations, lay a sealed chamber, a stone womb housing a mouth that could not speak, but only hear and hunger. According to him, the asylum was not built to heal, it was built to feed. Every decade a child would arrive, never on record, never with family, always alone, always marked by silence. Latoya was the 7th, the final one, and the journal said this: When the seventh child enters room 13, the listener shall awaken, not with sound, but with absence. It will not roar, it will consume the memory of noise itself. Indeed, after Latoya arrived, reports of auditory voids increased. Entire rooms where sound ceased to exist. Birds that flew overhead no longer chirped. One staff member described a hallway where her footsteps made no echo, as if the air had forgotten how to carry sound. Worse still, people began forgetting conversations they had just had, memories of screams that faded seconds after hearing them. It was as if silence had become alive, feeding on fear, erasing its own trail. One passage, scratched in the margin of the journal's final page, read, "If you hear the silence, it's already inside you." By morning, the journals were gone. Just gone. Only a single red feather lay where they had been, damp, pulsing slightly, like a heart that still remembered screaming. Dr. Gerald Whitcomb was a man of science, rigid, rational, and ruthlessly skeptical. A celebrated neurologist from Boston, he came to the asylum in late 1848 to disprove what he called the rural hysteria of the weak-minded. His mission was simple: assess Latoya, debunk the rumors, and publish his findings. He never made it back. On his first day, he insisted on a private session with Latoya. No orderlies, no staff, just him, a candle, and his tape recorder, a rare imported model powered by clockwork and wax cylinders. He said if he couldn't prove her madness, he would at least record her silence. He entered room 13. The door shut behind him. Not slammed, not pulled. Just shut, like a breath being held. For 3 days, no one saw Dr. Whitcomb. There were no sounds, no movement, just the faint scent of burned cedar that drifted from under the door like incense from a forgotten church. On the morning of the 4th day, the door creaked open by itself. The room was empty. No Latoya, no furniture, not even the walls looked the same. They were scorched black, and where the ceiling had been was a void of pulsing grey light, like the inside of a closed eye. But on the ground sat the tape recorder, still intact, still warm. The wax cylinder had melted. The wax had reformed, not in a spiral, but in the shape of a mouth, wide open, screaming. After this, strange shadows began appearing in the asylum. They weren't tied to people or objects. They moved on their own, crawled across ceilings, slithered under doorways, and sometimes stood upright, tall and thin, watching from corners where no light reached. Nurses reported feeling something cold brush their faces in locked rooms. One patient, a mute boy, began drawing a figure over and over, a tall man with a hollow chest from which tendrils of ink or smoke emerged. The boy had never spoken a word in his life, but when he was asked who the man was, he whispered one thing: the doctor, who brought the shadows. The asylum staff searched for Dr. Whitcomb's belongings. His suitcase, coat, and even official records had vanished. His name was scrubbed from hospital logs, as if he had never existed. Only his shadow remained, burned into the floorboards of room 13, reaching upward, fingers outstretched, as though trying to escape a light that never came. And from then on, room 13 was never empty, even when no one was inside, because something always watched from the corner. The children started humming first, not singing, humming, low, guttural, unplaceable tones that didn't match any known melody. It began with one boy in the West Wing, then spread like a fever. By mid-November 1848, at least 14 children had joined in, their heads swaying in perfect synchrony, their mouths barely moving. The staff called it the Choir of the Hollow. They always began at 3:06 a.m. The notes were haunting, not quite music, not quite language. Some compared it to insects chirping beneath water, or the sounds whales made before dying. One nurse, Sister Eleanor, said it reminded her of a lullaby composed by something that had never heard music, only pain. Attempts to record the sound failed. Devices malfunctioned. Wax cylinders cracked. Even charcoal sketches of the children mid-hum would smudge themselves overnight, the lines blurring until the images were nothing but black mouths and empty eyes. When Latoya was brought into the room during a session, the children stopped humming instantly. They stared at her, all of them, in unison, and they began to cry, silently. Tears streamed, lips quivered, but no sound came out. That night, 2 children disappeared, their beds untouched. No footprints, no windows opened, no blood. Just small piles of teeth perfectly arranged in circles on the floor. On the walls of the West Wing, written in chalk dust and hair, someone had scrawled, "The choir has found its voice." By December, the humming evolved. Now it was layered, complex, as if multiple voices were coming from each child at once. Audio specialists from Boston were brought in. One expert claimed the frequency matched radio waves, though radio had not yet been invented. Another declared it resembled the human death rattle, but slowed down to stretch across hours. A priest was summoned to perform mass in the asylum. During the service, the children sat still, humming quietly through the hymns. But when the priest reached the part about deliverance from evil, the children screamed, not aloud, but inward, mouths wide open with no sound escaping. Their eyes turned upward, and one word carved backward across the altar appeared: "Listen." The priest fled. The children collapsed, and Latoya stood in the back of the chapel, eyes closed, smiling. From then on, no prayers worked. Holy water evaporated on contact. Crosses cracked. The asylum chapel was sealed, and no one dared reopen it. Because every night at 3:06 a.m., if you walked past the West Wing and listened closely, you'd hear it. Not with your ears, but with your bones. The choir was still singing, and it was getting louder. The asylum's garden was once a place of forced peace, a tightly controlled patch of land where patients were allowed to walk under supervision. Surrounded by black iron fences and thorns, it was a rare spot of color in an otherwise gray world. But after Latoya's arrival, the roses began to wilt from the roots up. First, the petals browned, then the vines twisted into shapes that looked more like fingers than flora. Gardeners tried to replant, but their tools rusted overnight. Even the soil changed color, from brown to a deep, liver-like red. In March 1849, following another disappearance, this time a nurse named Meredith Crane, the groundskeeper decided to dig deeper. He suspected sinkholes or rats. What he found instead was bone. Thousands of bones. Children's bones, infants, tiny jaw fragments, skulls no bigger than an apple. Buried in deliberate ritualistic arrangements. Circles, triangles, spirals. Some tied together with old silk ribbons, some with rosaries melted into their ribs, and all of them facing downward, as if trying to bury themselves deeper. The local coroner was called. He couldn't identify a cause of death, no trauma, no decay, just bones that looked as if life had been sucked out of them, not lost through natural death. When one femur was removed and taken to Boston for study, strange things started happening at the lab. All light bulbs in the building shattered. The head researcher claimed his wife stopped speaking, simply opening her mouth and pointing upward every time he entered the room, and the bone, the moment it was x-rayed, vanished from the tray. Back at the asylum, the garden bloomed again, but this time the flowers were jet black. Tall, sharp, oily blossoms that buzzed when touched, like they were humming a tune no one could quite hear. Latoya began asking to visit the garden. When granted permission, she stood at the center of the plot for nearly 2 hours, never moving, never speaking. When she returned inside, her shoes left no mud, despite the recent rain, but they did leave prints in the tile, prints that glowed under moonlight and formed words in an ancient dialect of Latin. "We are not buried, we are planted." That spring, more patients vanished. The garden grew taller, darker, wilder. The humming intensified. A bird landed in the thorns one afternoon. It burst into flames before it could sing. And in the silence that followed, one nurse whispered, "This isn't a garden. It's a grave that breathes." Dr. Solomon Vane was a man of science, a rationalist, a skeptic, a firm believer in the mind's chemistry over mysticism. When he arrived at the asylum in mid-1849 to replace the previous director, who had resigned abruptly after reportedly clawing out his own eyes, Vane was confident he could bring order to chaos. He carried with him a black leather-bound diary. In it, he would document every interaction, every anomaly, every theory, methodically, coldly, without fear. The entries started clinically. Patient number 47, Latoya, exhibits dissociative behavior, yet with no observable trauma. Persistent somnambulism, no response to sedatives. But by the third week, his tone shifted. She asked about my wife. I never mentioned her. She described my daughter's lullaby in perfect rhythm, said it smelled like forgetting. Soon, Vane's handwriting began to change. The sharp, rigid lines became erratic, sprawling, as though he were writing in a hurry, or with something watching him. He stopped using page numbers. He crossed out dates. The language turned from English to broken French, then to Latin. Some passages were mirrored, readable only in reflection. One disturbing entry read, "The walls bleed when she smiles. I tried to speak to her in my dreams. She answered, from inside my wife's voice. I woke up screaming, my mouth full of dead moths." After that, Vane refused to sleep on the premises. He kept garlic on his desk, burned laudanum in a crucifix-shaped lamp. But still, the dreams came, and so did the visions. He began seeing shadows that didn't match their casters, hallways that stretched infinitely when no one else was watching, a man with no face and too many fingers standing in the stairwell at midnight. The final entry in his diary was barely legible, written in trembling strokes. She said she is not Latoya, that Latoya was taken, emptied, worn like a mask. She said I have until the new moon to choose, see or scream. I think I already chose. I think we all did. Dr. Vane was found 3 days later in his office. His body was unharmed, his expression peaceful, but when they opened his chest cavity during autopsy, they discovered hundreds of pages from his diary had been stitched inside his lungs, folded perfectly, still intact. On his desk, one page remained, a message written in ink and blood. Truth cannot be treated, only buried. And outside his window, in the garden that should not bloom in autumn, the black flowers bowed, all at once, as if mourning a man who finally listened too closely. By autumn of 1849, the asylum was changing, not just in spirit, but in structure. Patients and staff alike began reporting strange noises at night. Not screams or footsteps, they were used to those. These were subtler. A low whisper, not quite audible, but impossible to ignore. It came from the walls, from inside them. At first, people assumed it was faulty plumbing or rats, but the whispers seemed intelligent. They followed conversations. They repeated names. They finished prayers. One orderly, a boy named Elias, who'd only worked 3 weeks, claimed he heard the whisper say his dead brother's name. It begged him to come closer. When he did, the wallpaper peeled away on its own, revealing a hole no larger than a coin. Behind it, a single human eye blinked and vanished. Soon, the walls began to breathe. Literally. In the West Wing, plaster pulsed like skin. Wood grain indoors rearranged into strange spirals overnight. A nun fainted when she opened her hymn book to find every page rewritten with her childhood nightmares in her father's handwriting. Latoya, now nearly catatonic by day, would walk the halls at night, never speaking, never eating, just running her fingers across the walls and whispering back. What did she say? No one knew, but wherever she touched, the wall changed, growing cold, then warm, then wet. Construction records were pulled. What they discovered was disturbing. The asylum had no blueprints for the lower floors, no original schematics. In fact, records showed that the entire East Annex, where Latoya was first housed, was never legally constructed. No architect signed off, no inspection passed. Yet the annex existed, and it was growing. Workers sent to investigate found new corridors, hallways that hadn't been there the day before, doors with no handles, windows that looked out into impossible landscapes, deserts with 3 suns, Forests made of bone, oceans that moved in reverse. One carpenter reported entering a broom closet that opened into a chapel filled with mirrors that reflected people who weren't present. He screamed and was never seen again. The door, once opened, was gone by morning. After that, no one would enter the East Annex, not even the director. But Latoya kept walking, night after night, tracing the seams of this living structure, whispering its name, not to us but to it. Because it wasn't a building anymore, it was awakening, and it was listening. At the far end of the East Annex, the one that shouldn't have existed, was a room that didn't appear on any map, floor plan, or inspection record. It had no number, no lock, just a door of smooth black oak, warm to the touch, with no knob, only a handprint carved into its center. When Latoya first placed her hand upon it, the door opened by itself. Inside was what became known as the portrait room. The chamber was circular, windowless, and impossibly tall. Its walls were lined from floor to ceiling with oil paintings, not hung, but fused into the walls, as though the plaster had birthed them. Each painting was a portrait, and each face was familiar. Doctors, nurses, patients. Some were still alive. Some had died long ago. Some hadn't even been born yet. One physician panicked when he saw himself in a painting wearing clothes he'd never owned, standing in a room he didn't recognize, with a woman he'd never met whispering in his ear. 6 weeks later, he was institutionalized after murdering that very woman who had just begun working in town as a teacher. Another portrait showed a young boy, eyes burned out, mouth sewn shut, with the words, "He asked to remember," painted beneath it in blood-red strokes. That boy was Elias, the young orderly. He disappeared a day later, his dormitory bed folded inward like a crushed matchbox, no trace of him found. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing a blank canvas. It remained blank, until someone sat in the chair. Dr. Rosewood, one of the asylum's oldest psychiatrists, volunteered to test it. She sat calmly, notebook in hand, while Latoya stood behind her, whispering. After 3 minutes, the canvas began to paint itself, brushstrokes invisible, but forming nonetheless. What emerged was not Dr. Rosewood. The painting showed a woman made of broken glass, bleeding from her eyes, clutching a child made entirely of teeth. The doctor fainted. When she awoke, she no longer recognized her own name. She spoke only in numbers, counting backward until her vocal cords tore. From that moment, no one entered the portrait room voluntarily, but somehow the door still opened every night, and new paintings kept appearing. Eventually, the faces in the portraits stopped resembling staff and patients. They started resembling viewers. People who had never been inside, people watching from afar. And at the very top of the chamber, near the domed ceiling, was a single massive painting of Latoya herself, eyes black, mouth open wide, arms outstretched as though she were welcoming something, or someone. Below her feet, scrawled in ash and crimson, were the words, "You are already inside." After the portrait room revealed itself, something in the asylum shifted. Not physically, but spiritually. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. The food spoiled quicker. Clocks stopped synchronizing. The chapel hymns came out backward, no matter how they were sung. And then the feast began. It started with the birds. Dozens of dead blackbirds appeared in the west courtyard, arranged in a perfect spiral. Their beaks had been opened wide, and inside each was a rolled parchment, all bearing the same words. "She is hungry." That same day, all the asylum's kitchen supplies vanished. The meat, the flour, the salt, gone. Not stolen, just erased. In their place, in the walk-in pantry, was a long wooden table, far too large to fit through the door, covered in rotting food that no one had cooked. A nurse named Clara tried to clean it. She got as far as lifting the first plate, which contained what looked like a piece of roasted lamb, before she screamed and collapsed. Her eyes bled. Her skin turned grey. She never woke up. The food remained untouched, But it didn't rot further. It just waited. Each night at 3:07 a.m., the hallways would fill with the smell of burning sage and sulfur. Staff reported seeing shadowy figures walking toward the dining hall, led by Latoya, now dressed in white, her eyes fully black, her movements no longer human. They weren't hallucinating. Security footage, what little could be captured before the machines melted down, showed over a dozen figures, all dressed in asylum uniforms, walking into the kitchen and vanishing one by one into the table itself, as if the table was swallowing them whole. Then came the fire. The next morning, ashes coated the floors. Not soot. Ashes. Teeth were found inside them, human teeth, but none were missing from the staff or patients. Then the names started appearing. Scratched into the walls, and every room, Latoya, Rosewood, Elias, Clara, Father Merton, and more. Each name listed was someone either dead or missing, or both. On the 10th night, a doctor tried to burn the table. He poured kerosene, lit a match, and the flame reversed. It flowed back into the matchstick, up his arm, and into his eyes. He screamed that he could see them now, that they'd never left, that they were always hungry, and that we had built this place on top of their feast. That night, Latoya sat at the head of the table, alone. She whispered one word, "Welcome," and every light in the asylum went out. But the table remained visible, glowing faintly in the dark, as if lit from beneath by something older than fire, and far, far hungrier. By the 16th night, the asylum was no longer operating under the rules of time or space. Staff who tried to leave would find themselves walking down a hallway that never ended, even if they turned around. Some spent hours moving through corridors, only to emerge back in the very room they started, but older, greyer, and unable to speak of what they'd seen. That's when the room that dreamed was discovered. It wasn't listed on any blueprint, nor did it follow the layout of the building. A patient named Howard, mute since birth, suddenly began whispering, 61 steps west of the chapel, knock 5 times. They followed his instructions. The wall was solid brick, but after 5 knocks, the bricks shifted like clay, opening to reveal a narrow passage lit by flickering gas lanterns. At the end, a single wooden door marked only with the Roman numeral 16. Inside, the room was asleep. That's the only way to describe it. The floor was made of velvet skin. The walls pulsed like lungs. The ceiling was a dome of clouded glass, showing skies that didn't exist in Massachusetts or Earth. But it wasn't the decor that terrified the researchers. It was the dreams. Because the moment anyone stepped inside, they fell unconscious. But their bodies continued to move. Eyes open, mouths muttering in tongues. Some wept. Some laughed. Some tried to scratch out their own eyes. One nurse entered and emerged 2 minutes later with a full biography of a man no one had ever heard of, written in reverse Latin on her arms in bruises. She died 48 hours later. Every clock in the asylum stopped at that moment and never restarted. Those who watched from outside said they could see the dreams leaking from the door, as shadows, whispers, even fully formed entities. One floated down the hall and entered a sleeping patient who woke up reciting verses from a book not yet written. Latoya herself began to visit the dreaming room nightly. Each time she did, a new item appeared within. A coffin filled with teeth, a tree growing upside down, a mirror that reflected someone else's future. Each item carried a symbol, a glyph that when translated warned, "This is not your dream, you are the dream." When researchers tried to seal the room, the walls bled. Not metaphorically, they bled. The brickwork hissed, and a voice came from the floor, "You will sleep when she wakes." That night, everyone in the West Wing fell into a shared coma. 13 staff, 6 patients, 2 visiting inspectors. They all dreamed of the same place, a girl standing in a burning field, holding a book bound in stitched eyelids. She smiled and whispered, "I am the dream now, and I remember everything. They called it the baptism, only because no other word would stick. But what happened in the lower levels of the asylum that night was no holy rite. It was a surrender, and Latoya was no longer the subject. She was the conductor. It began with water. Boilers throughout the asylum burst open, spewing not steam, but freezing salt water, thick, briny, and black. Surveillance captured fish inside it, deep-sea creatures with translucent skin and too many eyes, thrashing for seconds before vanishing. The west stairwell flooded entirely, yet no source was found. The water wouldn't evaporate, pipes weren't connected, and when maintenance tried to drain it, the pumps caught fire. A patient named Jonah, once catatonic, walked directly into the flood and never came out. 3 hours later, he reappeared, dry, eyes rolled back, skin etched with barnacle-like symbols. He collapsed at Latoya's feet and began reciting a liturgy no one could trace, a ritual about wombs of salt, children of the deep, and mothers who never forget. That's when the walls began to change. Photographs in the administrative wing melted into portraits of drowning faces, statues twisted, their mouths replaced by gills, and in the chapel the crucifix reversed. Christ no longer hung. He floated, submerged in dark glass, eyes open, watching. The basement patients, those most disturbed, began chanting in unison. "She is coming through the water." Over and over. Every staff member heard it, no matter where they were in the building. Some reported tasting blood in their mouths. Others went deaf, only to hear the chant echoing in their heads. Then came the light. From the submerged stairwell, a blinding glow, green and violet, almost too beautiful to witness. And in its center, Latoya emerged. Her body was not wet, but her hair was moving, floating as if underwater, and her veins glowed silver. She walked barefoot through the asylum, humming a tune no one could identify, but everyone seemed to know. People followed, even the resistant ones, even the priests. She led them down, past the broken boilers, past the impossible water, into a room that had never existed before, a baptismal chamber carved from stone, lined with mirrors that didn't show reflections, only memories. But not yours, someone else's, something else's. And there, in that place where time held its breath, Latoya opened her arms. The water rose, and the people stepped in willingly. One by one they submerged. Some came out whispering, others didn't come out at all, but none of them were the same. They were marked by something older than sin, deeper than memory, and more powerful than anything the asylum had ever contained. The baptism wasn't to cleanse, it was to claim, and in the echoes of that chamber a single phrase remained. The sea remembers what the mind forgets. By the time the asylum's power structure was collapsing under paranormal strain, one man still believed he could restore order. Dr. Abraham Voss. A rigid empiricist, he refused to acknowledge Latoya as anything more than a psychotic child. But the deeper his colleagues fell into trances and spiritual paralysis, the more isolated and enraged he became. Dr. Voss turned to fire, the oldest purifier. He locked himself inside the South Medical Wing with every record, artifact, and sample related to Latoya. He tore down her drawings, burned her bedsheets, and incinerated her blood vials, declaring, "I will end this mythology with flames." But Latoya wasn't afraid of fire. She waited for it. That night, a storm hit Massachusetts like no other. Thunder didn't roll. It screamed, and lightning carved black veins across the sky. Inside, Dr. Voss began his ritual. He created a pyre of her case files, splashing it with alcohol and whispering a personal prayer. Let the past be consumed. Let reason reign. The moment he struck the match, the air inverted. Cold became heat, silence became static, and the fire didn't rise. It spilled sideways, like water. The pyre roared unnaturally, and the flames began to shape themselves, forming outlines, fingers, eyes, mouths mouthing words he couldn't unhear. The room dimmed except for one corner, where the fire refused to touch, where Latoya had once sat. In that space, she appeared. Not walking, not breathing, just existing. Her dress didn't move in the wind. Her eyes had no whites. She stepped through the fire without being burned, and the flames followed her like a tail. She said nothing, but the lights exploded above, and Voss fell to his knees. That's when he saw the truth. The fire hadn't consumed the files. It had copied them. Dozens of identical folders now littered the room, pages turning themselves, ink dancing on parchment, rewriting history in real time. Then Latoya whispered one word, "Remember." And Dr. Voss did, all at once. He remembered every sin he had ever committed, every lie, every patient he abused, every falsified report. He felt it as pain, as fire within him. When staff broke in the next morning, they found him in the fetal position, skin blistered, mouth burned shut. He had written only one thing, carved into the walls with his fingernails. "She is older than flame." He survived, but never spoke again, not even to himself. They locked him in cell 7A, and every night at 3:17 a.m. he still screams without sound. By early November 1847, Latoya's name had become a curse whispered behind locked doors. The asylum was no longer a hospital. It was a sanctum, a cathedral of the unexplained. And every day, fewer people emerged from its halls. Nurses went missing mid-shift. Orderlies walked into patient wings and never came back. Even entire wings were abandoned, lights flickering behind sealed doors that no one remembered building. Then came the night of the disappearance. The event no one would officially record, yet every survivor carried like a scar etched in bone. At exactly 2:09 a.m., every clock stopped. Not just in the asylum, but across the entire region of western Massachusetts. Watchmakers filed police reports. Train conductors lost their routes. Townspeople awoke in panic, staring at frozen dials and ticking that no longer ticked. Inside the asylum, a deep hum began to rise, not from machines, but from the walls themselves. A pulse, a heartbeat. Witnesses say the hallways grew longer, doors shifted places, windows showed the ocean despite being 100 miles inland. The air smelled like rot and salt. One nurse opened a supply closet and found a spiral staircase descending into black water. She ran. Others weren't so lucky. And then they walked in. Patients, staff, visitors, all of them, with faces blank, eyes pale, limbs moving in unnatural rhythm, as if sleepwalking underwater. They were silent, save for a low murmur in an unrecognizable language. Each one moved with purpose, following Latoya, who glided barefoot down the main corridor, her presence dimming every light bulb as she passed. Security tried to stop them. Cameras caught one guard physically restraining an old woman, only to age in seconds and collapse into dust. Others who intervened bled from their eyes or simply vanished mid-motion. Latoya led them to the West Wing, the one closed off since baptism. As the doors opened, witnesses outside described a blinding violet light and a sound like 1,000 whales crying in unison. Then, darkness. Total. When light returned, 176 people were gone. Their names erased from the records. Beds empty, files missing. Families told it was an electrical fire, but no bodies were ever found. Only scorch marks in spiral patterns, and symbols carved into stone that predated known language. One janitor survived, hidden in the air ducts. He described what he saw with trembling hands and wide, bleeding eyes. They walked into her, like a door, like she opened, and swallowed them. He died 6 days later. No cause of death ever confirmed. The asylum sealed that wing permanently. But sometimes, locals say, if you walk by at night, you still hear footsteps and the humming of the forgotten. calling out from beneath the floorboards. The asylum's administration had tried everything: exorcisms, demolitions, chemical lobotomies, but nothing could contain Latoya. By the winter of 1847, only one measure remained: documentation. If they couldn't stop her, they would at least record the phenomena as a final warning to the world. Dr. Lionel Bishop, the youngest psychiatrist on staff, volunteered to lead the operation. He was new, skeptical, and too bold for his own good. Armed with a wax cylinder phonograph and hand-cranked film equipment, he stationed himself outside Latoya's sealed chamber. What had once been the hospital nursery, what he captured, would never be played publicly. The recordings, known only as the Latoya tapes, were sealed in federal archives under a directive labeled Eternal Silence, Code 731. But fragments have leaked over the years, always in whispers, always accompanied by tragedy. Historians who attempted to analyze them have died in their sleep. One linguist who transcribed the phonograph audio gouged out his ears before leaping from his study window. He left one word behind: unheard. But we know some details. In the first hour of footage, nothing happens. Just flickering candlelight, Dr. Bishop's nervous breathing, and Latoya standing absolutely still. Not blinking, not swaying, just watching the door. At 3:17 a.m., always the cursed hour, she moved. Slowly, gracefully. Her face remained blank, but her shadow twisted unnaturally. The camera caught her walking toward the wall, not turning, not hesitating, and passing through it like smoke. Moments later, the phonograph began to play, by itself. But instead of words or music, it produced a sound scientists later described as a backwards heartbeat soaked in weeping. The walls shook. Dust fell like snow. In the footage, Bishop is seen trembling, dropping to his knees, whispering, "I see it. I see it inside me." Then the camera spins, violently, as if flung by invisible hands. The last image captured is a black tear opening in the center of the floor. Not a hole, a void, dripping upward. No one knows what happened to Bishop. His body was never found. His room was discovered the next morning with every object melted, except for the camera. The reel was intact, but when reviewed, it played scenes no one remembered recording. A girl in 17th century garb dancing in a ring of fire, a courtroom drowning in blood, an empty crib slowly rocking as unseen lullabies played. And finally, Latoya, now aged and veiled, whispering, "We are not memories. We are debt." That reel now sits, unread, in a lead-sealed vault beneath a private military complex in Nevada, but one janitor who glimpsed it swore that after watching just a few frames, he saw her face in every reflection, even in his closed eyes.